was I? We were all in our beds by now. Well, you were. Okay. Right. Thank you so much for coming along. Skills and development skills and skill gaps seems to be one of the most important themes arising in Davos this year, and that's why I'm so pleased to be the moderator for this Wharton lab. My name is Linda Bratton. I'm a professor of management practice at the London Business School, and I chair the World Economic Forum's Council on Leadership. So it's with huge pleasure that I'll be with you today. Let me just say a little bit about the structure, and then I'll introduce the panel. For those of you who haven't been to an IdeasLab, the way that it happens is each of our esteemed faculty speak for a couple of minutes, and it really is only a couple of minutes. And then at the end of that, after each person, I'll ask you for any observations or questions. We'll keep that to 1 or 2 minutes. We then have a series of breakout groups, and you have an opportunity, therefore, to pursue one of these themes a little bit longer. And then after the breakout groups, we'll reconvene and just talk generally about what we've learned. So it's going to be a marvellous morning. We'll be finished at 10:15. But can I first of all introduce Michael, who's going to say something about Wharton.
Thanks, Linda. Actually, I want to introduce the 4 faculty members that will be talking for us today. It's my pleasure to be here, and I hope the faculty are going to bring out some of their research and their expertise as it relates to this topic, and I think it'll be a good session. So first online today is Peter Cappelli, I think. And Peter is a professor of management at Wharton School. He's very well known for his work on human resources, his work on testing, performance management, public policy related to employment. And for many years, Wharton co-hosted a U.S. Department of Education Center National Center for Educational Quality and Workforce. And Peter co-directed this effort for us. And recently he served on the Business Roundtables Commission on Education and Workforce. So in fact, some of this whole session is motivated in part by some of the work Peter did and published in the Wall Street Journal on a series of a couple of articles related to the lack of hiring and the shortage of skills. And so it's good to have Peter. Howard Kunreuther is also a professor at the Wharton School. He co-directs the Risk Management and Decision Processes Center. He co-chaired the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Innovation and Leadership in Reducing Risk from Natural Disasters. And he served on the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Humanitarian Assistance. Harbir Singh, also a professor of management at the Wharton School. He's a co-director of the Max Center for Technological Innovation. He's a vice dean for us in global initiatives, and he helped shape Wharton's thoughts with regard to things we should be doing outside the United States, and leads those key efforts. And he's going to take that experience and bring it to us with regard to application of creative job creation outside the United States. And last but certainly not least is Mike Useem. You must know he's the director of the Center of Leadership and Change Management at the Wharton School. His work centers around leadership, decision-making, governance, and change in public and private and nonprofit sectors around the world. He's the author of several books, including Investor Capitalism and The Indian Way, which of course he co-authored with Harbir, Peter, as well as Jitendra Singh. And I think it'll be a very great session. I'm glad they could all join us.
Thank you so much. So we're going to start with the presentation, and Peter's up first.
So we're going to test the hypothesis that faculty can speak for only 2 minutes. See how this happens? We're going to talk about unemployment here at first. I think we're ready for our first slide. Worldwide, not news to you folks, hundreds of millions of people unemployed. The big issue is many of them for years at a time unemployed now, and young people coming into the labor force out of college without prospects at all. I have one of those graduates of my family, so I have a job. Big question, tons of unemployed. At the same time, employers complaining about not finding the skills they need to hire. Now, when you go around the world, you hear these complaints all over, but they're not equally distributed. Quick anecdote on this: Norway with very low unemployment, not having a problem finding people. U.S. with high unemployment, saying they are difficult finding people. Keep that in mind as we go through this list here. This is from Manpower that shows you the top 5 most difficult jobs to fill in the world. And you can see that some of these, like laborers, number 5, that's not a skill problem, right? But the other ones, most of them, skilled trades, sales representatives, technicians, these are all work-based skills, things that you learn on the job. The only one that comes straight out of school is engineers. Shouldn't the market take care of this? Well, a lot of the employers are saying they can't find the skills they need because people won't take the jobs at the wages they want to pay. That's not a skills problem per se, right? That's something different altogether, right? Hiring has its own problems, that is trying to get people hired. This is a little map of how you get a job in most organizations. A colleague told me in their company they had 26,000 applicants for an engineering position and none were apparently qualified. How could that be? It's because the technological systems for hiring, the software systems, have all these gates you have to clear. If you miss any of them, you're kicked out. Now some people also say the real problem is young people today just don't want to work as hard. There's really no evidence. The evidence actually suggests that young people today look exactly like we did when we were in their 20s. The values really seem to be almost identical. They're just younger, that's all. That's all the reason. The real reason seems to have something to do with more of a plug-and-play model of employment. We don't want to hire people, train and develop them anymore. We want to hire them and expect them to hit the ground running, the phrase you hear in schools now, make instant contributions without training, without any sort of big ramp-up time, right? And partly because of that, or related to that, is this problem of training. Right? Employers, at least particularly in North America, are not inclined to make investments in training much anymore. They feel that they are not going to recoup those investments. The skills everybody wants, 5 years experience doing something that nobody wants to give anybody. The initial experience to ultimately get those 5 years. That's the big catch-22. You can't actually read this chart, but let me just tell you, this represents vocational education across countries, and there are just big differences. Europe has a very good model of embracing work-based skills, apprentice programs, and education. UK, Australia, Korea, Japan, vocational experience in classrooms. The US and some other countries don't do much of that. We do it after you get out of school. We expect you to go back to college, proprietary school, community college, and get skills afterwards. This doesn't work very well, in part because people don't have the money to pay for it, which is a big issue. One of the big questions that's related to all of these problems is who directs training and skills. Here's what we know. The more embedded employers are in the process, the better the outcomes are. Employers who are working with schools, things work well. The worst programs seem to be top-down. That is, the government's trying to decide what the training experiences should be for individual students. That doesn't work very well at all. Leads us to the next question, which is who's going to pay for all this, right? The apprenticeship models are interesting because they're a mix of employer paying and employee paying through their own work experiences. Those seem to work pretty well. The individual employees don't have the money to pay for it themselves. Does this leave the government as the holder of the bag, as it were? In many cases it is. Now here's a quirky thing, at least in the US, we're seeing a third party develop, intermediary companies that will provide a workforce for you. They'll get together and say you need 100 employees with the following skills. We'll train them, we'll invest in them, we'll find them for you, but you pay a big premium for that. Is this going to be the answer? Well, it's still going to cost employers a ton of money. And then we get to the question of basic education, particularly in the developing world. And their employers, I think, have no choice but to try to help. The problem is it's a long-term investment. The payoffs are not immediate, but we've seen, particularly in places like India, it helps build brand, and it helps in the long term with reputation and recruiting. The question for us, people at the World Economic Forum, especially the business people, is what are we going to do, right? What kind of role will the employers have in this in our own organizations? Will we stand back and expect our most important asset to simply show up when we want it, or are we going to get engaged in the supply chain and try to do something to get the workers we want? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Well, and I have one question to pose for folks just to think about, and that's this one up here. We just left it off here. The factors that are making it difficult to get a skilled workforce. What are we going to do to meet that?
Thank you, Peter. We have a minute or two for questions, comments, observations. Henry.
The plug-and-play employment model, to me, really struck me as, wow, that's a really insightful observation. I don't think it was always that way, so I'm curious, when and why did that shift?
Okay, thank you. We're going to discuss these when we're in our groups, but thank you so much for putting that on the table, Henry. Yeah.
How is Wharton planning to change itself to cope with this year?
Yes. So what role of the business schools? Okay, thank you.
My question is, I have a question regarding regulation. Which countries protect their jobs? So regulations to recruit international talent or talent from abroad.
Yeah. So how is that going to play itself out?
Yes.
Yeah.
I had a question. The charts on vocational training and post-job education work on OECD.
Yeah.
I was wondering what it looks like in terms of developing the business in US versus China.
Well, thank you so much for those questions and observations. We're going to keep on moving, and then we'll have a more detailed conversation. Harbir is next up. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. So this is in fact a perfect transition. What Shiv just asked around what's happening in emerging economies. And the conversation in this conference has been about the great transformation and the problem of bridging supply and demand and market imperfections. Here's an example from Brazil. Unemployment lines in the 90s, and then the investment in manufacturing and auto assembly. And so in a sense, one of the ways of thinking about this, to Raji's question, is how do we build successful business models? These are some products from Embraer, which is the leading regional jet manufacturer in the world, coming out of Brazil. I at least would have not expected 20 years ago that Brazil would be the leader in regional jets. And you have private jets, regional jets, and also defense contracting by Embraer. And the interesting question is, how did this happen? Embraer was set up by the Brazilian government as a public sector undertaking, and then almost went bankrupt, went through privatization, but they retained the focus on regional jets because they felt that that was a viable market segment. And here's the interesting thing, creating an ecosystem of related and supporting industries which allowed the creation of jobs around this business model. So if the business model succeeded, then jobs in related and supporting industries would also succeed. And so managers need to look beyond the boundaries of their firm to create those jobs. Manish Subramanian is a Wharton MBA in India, and one of the things that he has done is to create an organization called Team Lease, which addresses the labor market imperfection Peter was talking about, which is how do we get workers for these jobs such as sales floor workers and payroll and so on. And it is a gateway to longer term employment potentially for people and creating enough vocational skills to do so. And Team Lease started with 7 employees in 2002, today has 75,000 employees. There is controversy around Team Lease because it is kind of contract workers and so on. And that brings us to the quintessential Indian setup of the software company, and Raji has been deeply involved in this with NIIT, but this happens to be Infosys, but could be any software company in India, and the creation of jobs really by bringing business over using internet connections, but then they discovered they did not have the talent, and this is Infosys's management center, 14,000 employees capacity, 14,000 at a time, 130 classrooms of 100 seats each. So this is one of the largest investments in training in any corporation, and by the way, Tata Consulting and Wipro are similar. So investment in related infrastructure. China, of course, has become the center of manufacturing around the world, and we have grown to accept that, but as little as 30 years ago, it was trying to get out of the throes of a more constrained economy. And some of the things they did was to become a source of efficiency and scale economies and began to dominate the toy manufacturing industry. And today they have ridden higher up the value chain. This is an example from a factory where they're producing higher tech equipment, and of course the workers are resting. So all is not good here. And the other side of this is job search in China. Remember, it was a country with lots of need for growth, and they lifted a lot of people out of poverty, but continue to have situations where people are looking for jobs even today. So in a sense, you can look at China as a source of scale and scope and efficiency. These are comparisons of GDP growth, and China's GDP growth has clearly been higher than India, and other competitive countries. And of course, you have the great skyline of Shanghai, Pudong. But at the same time, you have people looking for jobs in China today because of the reduction of demand from the West. And so, in a sense, what we have here is one of the things we heard in the China panel yesterday, which is perhaps the inadequate job resettlement resources. This is a job search area in Shenzhen province, a crush of people who might end up returning to the provinces. On the other hand, we have the gleaming factory floors producing, and I was actually surprised to see this number, 40% of all wireless Kindle, Xbox devices are produced in China, and actually mostly by a company called Foxconn, which today has 920,000 employees, about 400,000 of whom are in Shenzhen province. And Wharton actually sent its students there to look at the supply chain of Foxconn. Foxconn also has had some controversy recently, the debate around Apple putting jobs out there. But I think the interesting question is, for us, as people thinking about job creation, number one, how the insights. Number one, you have to have a winning business model. You have to have a business model that generates value. Secondly, you have to invest in related and supporting infrastructure, because sometimes you need that ecosystem. Are you part of a healthy ecosystem? And the third thing is, are you able to create a sustainable source of value in that business? And my question is, how do we innovate with organizations to create jobs continually in emerging markets? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Comments, observations. Actually, last time I forgot to say, would you say who you are and where you come from? Because that just helped us to build a discussion. Who's first? Thank you.
When you train these people, how do you keep them not to go to the competition?
There's a lot of this.
So we're not.
Good question.
Sit down. Marvellous question. Let's hold it for a moment. Thank you for that wonderful question. Who else? A couple more questions, just so that we can hear what's on your mind, but then we'll...
Yeah.
Who's next?
Here.
Yeah.
My name is Monica from South Africa. In a world that is changing so fast, how do you keep track, or how are you able to also quickly respond in terms of training?
Yeah. So in a rapidly changing world. Great question. Anybody else?
Benny from SMU, Singapore Management University. Why is it that the US has all this study done on emerging markets and yet you're not able to create jobs within your own country?
Great questions. I think we're going to have a marvelous conversation. Okay, well thank you so much for that, and thank you for the observations. Howard, you're next up.
Okay, I'm going to build on Peter and Harbir's comments and introduce risk into the picture. And so here you can see essentially one of the challenges we face with job creation and maintaining jobs. People perceive and firms perceive the risk in a very different way than they actually should assess the risk. And so the challenge we face is, how do we do a better job of risk management, recognizing there is this discrepancy? So here are some thoughts related to risk perception. We bury our heads in the sand and we say, this is not going to happen to us. It may happen to someone else, but not to us. This is below our threshold level of concern, and as a result, focusing on catastrophic accidents is something we don't pay attention to until they happen. And when they happen, we then say there are changed priorities. The problem, of course, is it's then often too late. Tony Hayward knew this after the BP oil spill and recognized that things could have been done beforehand. Union Carbide understood this after Bhopal. We know many examples of that. So the challenge we face is we have very short-term horizons. We are all very myopic. And as a result of this, we can't look into the future. We don't look into the future the way we should. We have a little acronym I'll put forward, NIMTOF, not in my term of office, as a way of sort of dealing with this. We also are very reluctant, firms, to incur the upfront cost for job creation and maintenance. We would basically say this is too expensive, we shouldn't be doing this now, and these investments can have long-term dividends, but the problem is we have to pay money up front in order to be able to deal with this and to maintain our stability, and we have our problem. There are weak links in the system. Interdependencies are extremely important, and one feature of that can create a whole set of challenges for firms, and we have to pay attention to these interdependencies and recognize there are transboundary risks. Let me give you a few examples to highlight some of these points. I've already mentioned the BP oil spill, and the fact of the matter is that things could have been done in advance to avoid the kind of disaster, and it had enormous potential repercussions not only for BP, but for companies around the world, and had things not been recovered quickly, we would have had a problem. Here's an example of a bridge in El Salvador that collapsed after a flood, and it highlights the point of infrastructure, not only in the context of transportation, but electricity and whatnot after a catastrophe. How do firms prepare for this in order to maintain the stability of their workforce and make sure that things are constituted over time? Here's a case that we know from the Japan earthquake in March. And it was not only Toyota that got affected, as we can certainly see here, but automobile companies around the world with respect to the supply chain problem. And so the interdependency here and the notion of what it does on jobs is extremely important. How do we deal with this? Well, this little diagram that I'm not expecting you to absorb in all the details highlights the fact that we have to deal with the risk assessment process, understand exposure assessment, the science, characterize the risk, and then figure out what firms can do to manage this, to preserve their jobs and maintain stability over time. We need to take steps before a disaster in order to be able to protect ourselves and mitigate. The tightrope walker here may not have this underneath the wire saying it's not going to happen to me, but the fact is that some protection may be necessary, just like firms have to deal with this. Here's an example of backup systems and the notion of really being able to somehow have generators, in this case, to handle a situation if things go out. Hospitals do this as a matter of course because they have critical functions to perform, but firms have a similar kind of concern. Basically, we would like to have money in hand. And the problem often is we don't have that, so you might want to think about long-term strategies. One example that one could pursue is long-term loans to help incur these investments along with insurance premium reductions. We need to somehow focus on well-enforced regulations and standards, rather than saying, hey, don't blame me, I don't like the laws, I just circumvent them. And that's a way to avoid the problems we deal with. And finally, the notion of outsourcing, which has been mentioned and is a part of this whole process. Don't have just one supplier, have several different suppliers to protect yourself. So the bottom line is these mechanisms will help us to somehow maintain stability, keep the jobs one has, also try to help create new jobs. And it's really in that spirit that I would like to pose the following question for the group. What are the challenges when firms face in order to take steps before the catastrophic disasters to maintain the stability, and what are opportunities for somehow dealing with that issue?
Great, thank you so much, Thank you. Observations, questions?
Can I use the first slide and stick it up in every one of my offices?
It's not patented.
Any other observations?
Yeah. Abdulaziz Al-Ghurair from the Emirates. There is always a cost for risk management. How much you pay and how much you don't. So it's expensive.
Right. Thank you. Mike, I think you're next.
Okay.
Yeah.
Super. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm going to pick up actually on what Howard just implicitly referenced, which is we all do worry about risk, catastrophic risk, we should. And the newest annual global risk report put out by the World Economic Forum this year identified for the coming year one of the world's biggest risks is income inequality, and that's got something to do with what we see right here, certainly in the U.S. Fairly high unemployment, pushing 8.5% right now, or a little bit down to 8.5%, I should say. But the point I want to make with this is that traditionally, unemployment, income inequality has been, certainly in the U.S., something that the Congress and the White House is worried about. But right over here, maybe the more current picture, we all know we're pretty much gridlocked in the U.S. And thus, I think if government, if state institutions aren't going to begin to weigh in on income inequality, let's turn to Howard Schultz. Now, he serves wonderful coffee through 17,000 outlets. But this year, Fortune magazine put Howard on the cover as the CEO of the year because he has pushed his own enterprises around the world, 17,000 franchises, to ask customers to give money to a foundation to create jobs. A little bit of social marketing here. If you walk into Starbucks, please do this. I'll come back to that in a few minutes later, in fact. Give $5, it goes to a foundation looking to create inner city jobs. We will give you a bracelet. There it is. Now, if Howard's going to do this, though, if other chief executives, some of you in this room, are going to be able to pursue that course of making a difference if Congress is not in our case, you've got 7 forces to contend with. Number one, if you look at Howard Schultz's holdings, very institutional. So institutional investors in the U.S. or their equivalent around the world, this diagram meant to bring out the fact that 70% of the holdings now, places like Starbucks, are held by the big investors such as Fidelity. Upper left-hand corner is the second in the family line, Ned Johnson, to run the company. The famous Peter Lynch up here in the upper right, he ran the Magellan Fund, average rate of return 29%, and if you don't get something that Peter was able to get, Ned Johnson has a habit of pushing you out. Second force that Howard Schultz has to work with, or you, are the equity analysts. In the U.S., we've got 7,000 to 8,000 equity analysts, the so-called sell side. They've got a strong point of view about employment, and sometimes it's counter to the idea of job creation. Third force, most countries now, or many countries, have a consortium of institutional large holders. In the U.S., it's called the Council of Institutional Investors. Collectively, CalPERS, Fidelity, they've got about $3 trillion under management. They weigh in on these issues. This looks like Davos, it's not. This is about a dozen American CEOs who are part of the Business Roundtable. Peter has worked with them. Business Roundtable, unfamiliar to many of you, it's a consortium basically of chief executives of large firms. They collectively can offer and put forward what individually they can't do. I think I'm up to number 4, number 5 here. This is the board of directors of GE. My view is that the board itself is there in part to provide a buffer between the equity market and what chief executives do. Back to Howard's point, to think longer term and not real short term. So working with your board, vital as well. Lots of people, most of you will recognize, and I know some of you in this room are friends with. This is, I think, number 6 on my list. It is the office of the chief executive. I have 9 Indian CEOs. We can put the similar gallery together for most countries. And this is, again, the place where a difference can be made. Number 7, and I'm coming to a couple solutions now. Number 7, the institutional holdings that have become so dominant in the U.S. now, spreading worldwide. If you look at the Japanese equity market, Britain, Brazil, it is increasingly cross-border. So the forces coming from the institutional investors on you or Howard Schultz are all looking more international. 3 solutions, and I got 2 questions. Solution number 1, let's take the Fortune 500. If they only added, let's say, 1,000 people to the payroll the coming year, they could reduce the unemployment rate in the U.S. by ½ a point. So companies intervening, making a difference. I offered this diagram here. I think everybody will recognize, almost everybody. This is a gentleman who I think you all know in India, former CEO of Infosys, is putting together a national identification system. These are people who all focused on mission, not themselves, not their personal gain. And now this really comes back to Davos. We need not more, this is very US-centric, not more elephants, a certain Republican Party over there, not more Democrats. We need more unicorns, which is to say we need to get out of the box, transcend our own particular niche, and begin to work collaboratively. So if Davos we have a problem, unemployment, rising income inequality, big risk. Davos actually may offer up, because all these forces meet here, a solution. So here are my two questions. Number one, got it up here on the board. Put yourself in Howard Schultz's shoes, or the shoes you wear yourself. With all those factors around you, how are we going to work with you, or how can you work with others to begin to focus on employment as a long-term chronic problem that just has to receive some attention directly from the private sector? If many public sectors, the state system is unable to really begin to weigh in to solve. The second question is this. I did bring Howard Schultz's wristband right here, and he does ask for donations of $5 to $250 to create jobs. So who will give me at least $5? Okay, good. We've got some takers. So, Linda, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Observations, questions? Yeah.
Michelle Green from the US. You mentioned if each of the Fortune 500 created a couple of jobs, that would solve the problem. But when we look at net new job creation in the US, isn't it really small business that's driving net new job creation?
Interesting point. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah, Jen Bedell from IE Business School. I was wondering, could I have a crack at just summarising, I think, the four main messages?
Not at this stage.
Not at this stage?
No, this is a question.
Okay.
But you can later.
All right.
Yeah, process. What's your question?
No, that was it. I was just trying to clarify the four main problems in terms of unemployment that I'd heard.
Okay, we can. I don't think we have time for that. I'm so sorry. Any questions? Yeah.
Elizabeth Esty, running for Congress in the United States. How do we deal with this combination of short-termism on the electoral cycle and quarterly pressure on the corporate side, which is leading, I think, to this unwillingness or inability to invest in education and training long-term on both sectors at the moment?
That's a great question.
Well, thank you. Well, a few more questions, Chief.
For me, the issue is we talk about job creation, all these things, but in a way, I think, you showed slides of Gandhi and Mother Teresa. What are we really doing to create values in the next generation about being creative participants in the job market?
A quick question on the tensions on technologies that actually reduce the number of jobs that firms need.
Yeah. Fantastic question. So what we're going to do now is we're going to break up into groups. I'd like you to go to one of these questions. If too many of you go, then we'll do we'll do some nudging, but let's assume that you can sort that out equally. In terms of timing, well, two things to say. We'd like you to come back with challenges, but also solutions. That's the hard bit, isn't it? So do come back with solutions. In terms of timing, we need to be, we're running actually about 4 minutes late, but I'm going to say, let's be back here by 10, which just gives us 15 minutes to wrap up. So if you can be ready for a quick summary, we're going to reconvene at 10. That gives you 20 minutes to